Welcome to episode 2 of the Buddhist Psychology podcast. I'm Lisa Dale Miller. I'm an MFT as well as a somatic experiencing practitioner and a Buddhist teacher. The topic for this episode is equanimity. In Western psychology, equanimity is described as the display of a balanced perspective, and equanimity is considered necessary for resilience. In ancient Greece, both the Epicureans as well as the Stoics viewed equanimity as a central virtue to cultivate. Equanimity in Western medicine has been framed as cognitive, affective imperturbability. That's like a coolness or a presence of mind that the physician has no matter what circumstances they're facing. Such imperturbability helps a clinician maintain and model well-being in the midst of a patient's distress. And I think you might agree with me, that's something we all need more of. In Buddhist psychology, equanimity is one of the 4 Brahmavihāras, or divine abodes. And equanimity is described in Buddhist psychology as a neutral feeling tone of experience, or a mental quality of impartiality or mental equipoise. And these qualities of equanimity are cultivated usually through several different kinds of Buddhist practices. Equanimity is a core virtue in Buddhism, and it's largely described as non-attachment to pleasurable or painful experience. It's viewed as a character trait as well as an active self-regulation skill. If we view equanimity with a modern clinical lens, we could say that equanimity builds distress tolerance. One common misunderstanding about equanimity is that it's devoid of emotion or emotionally driven reactivity. Equanimity actually facilitates a rapid return from reactivity to cognitive affective responsiveness. So for instance, anytime craving or aversion might arise in an equanimous mind, those impulses are recognized and then almost spontaneously released without undue resistance. In Buddhist psychology, equanimity is also associated with one-pointed awareness, which gives rise to a collected and unified mind. This is often the object and hopefully the goal of most concentration meditation practices. In fact, trait equanimity is one of Buddhism's 7 factors of enlightenment, and it's considered necessary for the liberative insights that Buddhism associates with samadhi and moksha, and of course their result eventually, which is nibbana or enlightenment. All 4 Brahmaviharas have what are known as a near enemy and a far enemy. A near enemy seems like equanimity, but it is definitely not equanimity. And a far enemy is anything but equanimity. So, indifference is the near enemy of equanimity. The equality and impartiality of equanimity are not indifference or ambivalence, because equanimity uncouples caring from fear and anger. So you could see equanimity has the compassionate impulse built into it. When all beings are regarded equally, the desire to help flows freely in any direction. If you ask any first responder, they will attest to the effectiveness of maintaining a calm, attentive neutrality in the midst of a crisis. That is equanimity. Craving and aversion are the far enemies of equanimity. An equanimous mind is less likely to avert or grasp habitually at pain and pleasure. Why? Because the quality of equanimity means one is able to stay present no matter what is occurring. That is why equanimity is the 4th Brahmavihāra. You really need to practice the first 3: loving kindness, sympathetic joy, and compassion before you can put it all together into equanimity. There is clinical research on equanimity, and this happened because at some point in the mindfulness research craze, the researchers asked themselves, okay, well, what is giving us this result when we teach people to practice mindfulness meditation? Equanimity turned out to be one of the really important results of mindfulness practice. So there is something called the equanimity scale number 16. It's a 16-item self-report mindfulness scale to assess the level by which a patient is taking a non-reactive attitude to thoughts, feelings, and experiences. It does get pretty high marks for rating levels of trait and state equanimity. So trait equanimity is baked into how the person shows up in the world. There's no need to cultivate. State equanimity is what shows up on the way to trait equanimity. There are practices to cultivate equanimity. When we practice them, we start to experience more state equanimity. One result of increasing equanimity that research has shown is it seems to mitigate and lessen the negative effects of perceived stress and neuroticism on depression symptoms. And that's important. Yeah, depression is rumination on the self in a very destructive manner. If a person is experiencing stress and high levels of neuroticism, depressive symptoms become worse. So how can therapists cultivate and remain in equanimous states of mind during a session? First, we have to get to know and work with our own reactivity. And of course, recognize the stimuli that activate the arising of such reactivity. This is really the best way to cultivate equanimity. But we spend our hours with patients, and often patients are having some experience, and all of a sudden the therapist will notice that they are also having a reaction to what the patient is telling them. This is known as countertransference. So the therapist has their own personal reaction to material arising in the patient, and that reaction is not about the patient, it's about the therapist. Western psychotherapy prescribes many techniques that a therapist can learn to work with countertransference. Honestly, I recommend Irvin Yalom's seminal book on how to accomplish effective self-disclosure. It's called The Gift of Therapy, and it really is a manual for how to skillfully recognize and work with countertransference in the moment when you are with a patient, and also afterwards when you're on your own. Your daily life is also a great habitat for recognizing what sets you off kilter. And every Buddhist yana recommends vigilant mindfulness of mental phenomena as a means to root out habit reactivity. When we apply vigilant mindfulness with an attitude of open-heartedness toward the reactivity itself, and also toward the imperfect way in which we usually respond to that reactivity, it usually makes the process of recognition and working with reactivity much more easeful. Learning how to rest in the coming and going of internal and external experience is key for maintaining equanimity in the midst of perturbance. That sentence alone is the prescription for how a therapist can maintain equanimity with a patient who is not having equanimity. When mental automaticity is nipped in the bud, intentional presencing becomes one's default mode of being in the world. That's trait equanimity. Formal equanimity meditation practices are the other path of cultivation. So how can therapists introduce patients to equanimity? And what kind of cultivation methods can they impart? When we model equanimity, that in itself is the best introduction for patients. They see it, they want it, and often they'll ask, wow, how can you Do this all day long. Be with people with such presence and openness. They'll ask, and you just say, well, I practice. I'm happy to give you some skills so that you can also show up in your life this way. So Theravada Buddhism recommends meditating on specific phrases to cultivate equanimity. And these particular phrases will help a person develop wise view, appropriate boundaries, and right action. So I'll just speak these phrases out so you can hear them. All beings are the owners of their karma. Their happiness and unhappiness depend on their actions, not upon my wishes. So this is a very short and pithy practice with so much depth and meaning. When other people face difficulties, compassion inspires a person to help, and wisdom grants that person the strength to avoid feeling responsible for the conditions that are probably beyond their control. So when we hold with equanimity what we wish, what we want to have happen, alongside what is actually happening or possible even to happen, and that could be very different than what we want to have happen. We don't heap more suffering onto already existing trials and tribulations that we may be experiencing. I think most of us have had the experience of sitting with a patient that we really care about deeply, and there's a level of stuckness around something in particular. They just can't seem to unwind. They can't seem to understand, and the desire to have them wake up and be released is so strong in a moment like that. And yet, it's so important for us to hold that alongside where the patient actually is, who they actually are, what they actually are capable of in a moment like that. This really is equanimity and compassion together. The other Theravada methods are based on the Buddha's instructions for practicing the 4 Brahmavihāras. So equanimity is cultivated by practicing an attitude of neutrality toward all beings, everywhere. And this neutrality is devoid of egoic over-involvement and clinging to any being in particular. It arises from experiencing life's twists and turns without resistance or preference. In Mahayana Tibetan Buddhism, there is an advocation of the cultivation of equalness. So equalness develops non-referential compassion and bodhicitta. Bodhicitta means the awakened heart-mind. So what I just said earlier, that neutrality toward all beings, is what Tibetan Buddhism means when they use the word equalness. And by the way, you may work with patients who have a strange habitual way of viewing themselves as other than all beings. They're always very kind and very giving and very forgiving and whatever else to everybody else, but when it comes to them, they have trouble offering any of that to themselves. One of the things the practices on equalness does, it affirms very clearly, yes, you are a being like all other beings, and you are deserving of your own compassion and care and respect. Tibetan Buddhism has a whole range of practices to cultivate equalness. But one of the simple ones that they suggest is to reflect on a very simple truth. So here is the truth that they wish a practitioner to contemplate and cultivate. All beings yearn for happiness and wish to be free of suffering. Very simple truth, with very powerful ramifications when it's practiced informally in daily life. So the way to do that is in the midst of your daily life, no matter what's showing up. Let's say someone is showing up in a way that is particularly perturbing or distressful. When a person reminds themselves, whatever this person is doing, ultimately they're doing it because all they want is to be happy and to not have pain and suffering. Now, people can apply that desire in very harmful ways. However, a practitioner that is able to view actions, thoughts, speech that arise from a very deep misunderstanding of how to seek happiness and how to liberate oneself from suffering. If a practitioner can really bring that to an engagement with a difficult person, it can make all the difference in how a distressful situation is mitigated. Using that simple phrase, one can also practice more formally using a Theravada-like method. And that looks like this. You would contemplate a series of increasingly challenging people, ending with all beings everywhere. As you repeat the phrase, all beings yearn for happiness and wish to be free of suffering. So this is a visualization practice. And as you bring each of these increasingly difficult people to mind and their challenging actions, allow yourself to really reflect on how they got it wrong, but how ultimately happiness and an end to their suffering is what they are really wanting. What I'd like to do is just have us practice a little bit. So let's begin by having you take a comfortable seated position. And if you happen to be driving, many people drive while they're listening to podcasts. What I most want you to do is remain attentive to your driving and to where you are driving and how you are driving. So take a very comfortable seated position, and you can do this with eyes open or closed. It doesn't matter. To begin with, presence the experience of your body sitting, whether you're sitting up in bed or you're sitting on a chair or you might be sitting on a meditation cushion. Just allow your awareness to open and include the physical feeling of your body in a seated position. Really feel the weight of your head and neck on your torso and the weight of the torso dropping fully into the pelvis and your sits bones, your thighs, and your legs. And you have a choice. If you wish, you could bring to mind a person in your life who you may have a tendency to take responsibility for things that are actually their responsibility. And this can be in a small way or it can be in a big way. So if you have someone like that, you can just bring them to mind. If you don't have someone like that, you're a very bounded person and you don't have any issues like that, then I would like you, as best you can, to bring all beings everywhere to mind. And the way to do that is to recognize, ultimately, we are all just humans walking on this planet. So that's a really nice way to bring all beings to mind. So now I will say these two phrases, and I will have a little pause period so that you can repeat to yourself each of these phrases. All beings are the owners of their karma. Their happiness and unhappiness depend on their actions, not upon my wishes. All beings are the owners of their karma. So you can also say, all beings are the owners of their actions. Means the same thing. Their happiness and unhappiness depend upon their actions, not upon my wishes. So you might be feeling open as you say this. You might be feeling a little constricted. Whatever's arising in you, see if you can meet it with a kind of open-heartedness. And this open-heartedness is not acceptance. It is literally the capacity to recognize, look what's showing up inside of me, and just to let it be. Don't grasp at it. Don't try to fix it. Don't try to change it. So we're going to do the phrases one more time. And this time, as you repeat the phrase to yourself, I want you to see if you can ground it in the wisdom that it is offering you. This deep knowing, yes, it's true. All beings are the owners of their karma. Their happiness and unhappiness depend upon their actions, not upon my wishes. So you may feel the wisdom penetrating your heart, your mind. You may have different kinds of emotions coming and going. You might even have insights. I really didn't think of this that way. Whatever comes, let it come. Ultimately, these phrases are an opportunity to acknowledge autonomy. For those of you who are clinicians, these two phrases are extremely important to practice. We must always be recognizing the autonomy the people we work with ultimately have. We can try our best to give them all kinds of skills, to help them to transform, but ultimately, they have to do the work themselves, and that is a matter of autonomy. Ultimately, we can never fully take responsibility for whether they change, shift, get worse. It's if we know that we are offering the best possible skills and clinical presence that we can, and still things are not changing. They won't do what we suggest. These patients are the owners of their own karma. Their happiness and unhappiness depend on their actions, not on the wishes of the clinician who's working so hard to help them lessen their unhappiness and cultivate more equanimity. So just notice what's arising for you as you hear me put forth this kind of wise recognition about what we can and cannot do as clinicians. And see if you can be open-hearted toward whatever feelings may arise, particularly the ones that may not be very pleasant. This is when equanimity is really helpful because of the care that is imbued in the sense of recognition. Yes, I wish this was some other way. I've tried my best. And now I must offer them their own autonomy and respect that autonomy. So now, allow your awareness to expand again and just feel your physical presence. And just notice, how did the body experience this kind of practice? How is it now? And if you've been doing the practice with your eyes closed, allow your eyes to gently open, and equally gently, maybe just let them roam around whatever room you're in. And if your eyes were open the whole time, you probably were doing soft gaze and not looking at anything in particular during the practice. Now let your eyeballs roam freely and really take in the room. This is the teaching that I am offering today on equanimity. I'm always happy to hear responses and take questions. Please feel free to reach out to me using the Integrative Psychotherapy portal on Substack. So I'll see you for episode 3 of the Buddhist Psychology Podcast.